Hi, we're continuing Wilfred Grenfell, Chapter 7. Back to Labrador. The Albert made her way farther up the Labrador coast, alternating between visiting the fishing fleet working the rich fishing ground of the Grand Banks and visiting the small communities dotted along the coastline. Wherever the men were, the people were excited to see them. As the ship made her way up the coast, Wilfred found variations of the circumstances he had seen at Domino Run. Teenagers had rickets, young men coughed blood, and little girls suffered from exposure from wearing nothing more than 2 flour sacks sewn together with fishing line. And he met with the same level of surprise. Although news of the presence of the Albert spread quickly up the coast, few people believed it would actually stop in their tiny settlement, or that there really was a doctor on board who would treat them for free. The more Wilfred saw of the conditions on the Labrador coast, the angrier he became. These fishermen and their families, both the Liviers and those who wintered over in St. John and came north to fish off Labrador in the summer, found themselves in hopeless situations. In talking with Captain Fitzgerald, Wilfred learned that the trawler owners and the fish merchants liked it that way. They preferred to keep the fishermen, particularly the strong young men, in debt to them as a way of keeping them fishing year after year. To do this, they set the price of the catch, no matter how large or small it was, to cover only the bare necessities of life. A Labrador fisherman found himself working non-stop for the 5 months of fishing season, then subsisting with his family on a few barrels of flour, several quarts of molasses, tea, and fat, all sold to him by the trawler owners at inflated prices. The fishermen supplemented their diet with any fish they had managed to drive for themselves during the summer, and those who owned rifles and could afford bullets shot small game, such as foxes and deer, to eat. There was no money left over to buy clothing or fishing equipment, and year after year the fishermen and their families sank further and further into debt, buying their basic commodities from trawler owners. Wilfred met only one missionary working among the Liviers, but in Hopedale, the northernmost point of Albert's voyage up the coast, he did encounter a band of Moravian missionaries. The Moravians, whose predecessor had been coming to Labrador for over 100 years to work among the Eskimos, welcomed Wilfred and put him straight to work. One of the first patients he saw there was a man whose arm had both been blown off when a cannon misfired. Although the Moravians had done what they could, the stumps of the man's arm had become gangrenous. Wilfred took the man back to the Albert and operated to remove the gangrene. It was uncertain whether or not the man would live, but Wilfred knew that without the medical aid he had given, the man would have died an agonizing death. Other cases were more straightforward to treat and yet rendered dramatic results. A fisherman had hobbled around for 3 years with what he thought was an incurable foot ailment. It turned out to be nothing more than an ingrown toenail, which Wilfred was able to correct in a matter of minutes. The fisherman was then able to go back to work, making a scant living for his family. In October, the fishing boats sailed back to St. John to avoid being iced in for the winter. By this time, Wilfred and the crew of the Albert had given away all the clothing, books, and magazines aboard, visited 50 settlements, treated 900 patients, and held hundreds of church services on land and sea. Most of Wilfred's patients had never before seen a doctor or a midwife, and they knew very little about medical matters. In the absence of a doctor, many people had invented cures for themselves. Some of these cures appalled Wilfred, who wondered how such superstitions could be passed on as medicine along the coast. One old woman he met prescribed swallowing 9 lice every 3rd day for 9 days as a cure for stomach ailments. Another time he saw an amulet around a man's neck that contained the tooth of a dying deer. A sure way to stop fits, he was told. Perhaps the most common cure that Wilfred saw was a mixture of white paint and herbs, which was supposed to draw out an abscess. The Albert followed the fishing fleet back to St. John's. On the way down the coast, she stopped in once again at Domino Run, where Wilfred had tended his first patient. It was a somber moment when he walked past a freshly dug grave on his way up the mossy trail to the dirt hut. A woman confirmed his worst fears. Her husband had died 2 weeks before. Wilfred's heart broke as he surveyed the scene. 6 young children and their widowed mother, all looking thin and ill. He offered them some of what was left of the ship's supplies and once again prayed for them before he left. The Albert sailed into St. John's Harbor to a rousing welcome. Many of the fishing boats were already anchored in the harbor, and news of the Albert's service to the fishermen and residents of Labrador had spread throughout the town. Willing hands reached out to take the Albert's mooring line as she tied up alongside the wharf, and many people offered food and housing to the crew. Wilfred was invited to stay with Governor Sir Terence O'Brien, who had returned from England. As Wilfred accompanied the governor to his house, he was amazed to see the progress that had been made in rebuilding the town. Many new wooden houses and warehouses dotted the rocky inlet. Everywhere Wilfred went, fishermen and their families flocked around him, thanking him for his service and the encouraging work he was doing. Within hours of arriving back in St. John, it seemed that every door in the place was open to the national mission to deep-sea fishermen. A reporter from the local newspaper interviewed Wilfred for a lead article on the work of the mission. A committee of politicians and merchants invited Wilfred to address them on the needs he has seen on his trip and to offer suggestions on how to meet those needs. Wilfred and Captain Trezzy attended the meeting together, and they were excited to see how serious those in attendance were about tackling the problems fishermen face. At the meeting, Dr. Moses Harvey proposed a resolution thanking the national mission to deep-sea fishermen and their missionaries. Then he added, "This meeting also desires to express the hope that the directors of the mission may see their way to continue the work thus begun, and should they do so, they may be assured of the warmest support and cooperation of all classes in this community." Another meeting followed the first, and Wilfred was delighted to see just how much help the politicians and merchants of St. John's were willing to give. The government offered to erect 2 hospitals, leaving the sites for them up to the mission to decide. They also offered to furnish the hospitals according to the directions submitted by the Missions Hospital Committee and to pay for the maintenance and upkeep of the buildings. A prominent merchant, Benge, offered a large house in Battle Harbor on the south coast of Labrador to be used as one of the hospitals. Wilfred thought the second hospital should be situated at Indian Harbor at the mouth of Hamilton Inlet, midway up the coast. While these developments excited Wilfred, in his mind they were only the beginning. The Albert was a sturdy vessel, but she was dependent on the right wind conditions for power. Wilfred thought that a steam-powered launch would be a much more versatile craft in a variety of weather conditions. He envisioned doctors and nurses manning the hospitals while he steamed up and down the coast, stopping in on the Rivières and tending to the immediate need of the fishing fleet. Finally, after the meetings were over and the ship was restocked, it was time to set out across the Atlantic for England. On November 8th, half of the population of St. John turned out to see the Albert off. As Wilfred waved from the bow, he yelled to the people, "I promise we'll be back. God bless you all till we meet again." Soon they were out in the open water of the Atlantic Ocean. The waves were high, but by now the crew of the Albert worked seamlessly together, and they encountered only one problem on the 12-day passage to England. On day 6 of the voyage, when all of the maintenance work was completed for the day, Wilfred started a game of cricket on deck with several other crew members. By now, they were down to only one cricket ball, the others having been battled overboard during previous games. About 10 minutes into the game, Wilfred watched in dismay as the last ball sailed past him and splashed into the ocean. He looked down at it bobbing on the surface. There would be no more cricket game on board during the voyage. In an instant, Wilfred kicked off his shoes and yelled over his shoulder, "Tell the captain to tack back and pick me up." With that, he climbed over the railing and dived into the water. The sudden cold of the ocean took his breath away, but he surfaced and began swimming toward the ball. As he did so, he watched the Albert tacking away from him. Wilfred recovered the ball and stuck it in his pocket, but it was another 20 minutes before the ship tacked back and came alongside him. He treaded water and waited patiently for it to arrive. When the Albert had finally maneuvered close enough to him, he grabbed the rope ladder that dangled over the side and climbed back aboard. Once he was safely on deck, Wilfred learned that the captain had been so shocked when he dived overboard that he had tacked in the wrong direction. Wilfred laughed at the mistake. Treading icy cold water was just the kind of challenge he loved. He went below and changed his clothes, and then the cricket game continued. The remaining 6 days of the voyage were uneventful, and soon the ship was docking in Yarmouth. Everyone, including the Mission Council, was eager to hear about the crew's experiences in Newfoundland. Within days of arriving back in England, Wilfred was off to London to give a report to the council. He told the gathered council members all about what he had seen and the small ways they had been able to help the people of Labrador on both land and sea. He painted a picture for them of what could be done with more medical missionaries and resources. In return, the council filled Wilfred in on what had been happening in the mission during the 6 months he had been away. They now had 11 ships and had extended their ministry to fishermen on the south and west coast of England and to Ireland. Obviously, they explained, the mission had spread out, and they were not sure whether there was enough momentum to fund a work overseas. The voyage of the Albert had cost £2,000, and they could not commit to spending that amount on a regular basis. Such talk only served to challenge Wilfred, who set out with Captain Trezzy on a speaking tour of England to raise money for mission work on the Labrador coast. Everywhere he went, Wilfred captivated audiences, and the money flowed in. Many local committees were formed, each one undertaking to sponsor one bed in the new hospitals the committee in St. John's had promised to provide. When Wilfred spoke to the boys at Mostyn House School in Parkgate, they enthusiastically offered to sponsor a bet as well. When he told the boys the story of playing cricket on the Albert deck and losing the ball overboard, one of them suggested Wilfred drill a hole through the ball and tether it to the ship's railing. Wilfred thought this was an interesting idea and promised to report back on how well it worked. Based on Wilfred's success in fundraising, the board of the National Mission to Deep-Sea Fishermen voted in February 1893 to continue and extend the work in Labrador, with Wilfred heading it up. Nothing could have delighted Wilfred more. He longed to be back among the Liviers and the fishermen, bringing them the message of hope and healing their bodies. It was a warm day in May when the Albert was once again towed out of the River Yare. On board were 3 doctors, Wilfred Grenfell, Elliot Curwen, and Wilfred's old friend, the Australian Arthur Bobart. 2 nurses, Cecilia Williams and Ada Carwadine, would soon set sail for St. John's aboard an Allen Line steamer. Ooh, he got the steamer he wanted. Wilfred grinned from ear to ear as he watched the commotion around him. The fishermen's brass band played energetically on the Albert's deck. The other mission ships in port were rigged with fluttering flags, and the sound of the cheering crowd was punctuated with signal guns saluting the crew and their mission. In the ship's hold, thousands of pounds of donated goods, clothing, books, and supplies to equip the hospital were packed away in bales. As the Albert was towed out into the open sea, Wilfred watched the crowd slowly fade into the distance. The brass band and other visitors who had been aboard transferred to the tugboat, and then the tow line was let go. Once again, they were on their way. This time, though, they planned to stop at many ports along the south coast of England, where Wilfred and Captain Trezise intended to speak as many churches and halls as possible. As they informed people about their proposed work in Labrador, Wilfred prayed that somehow God would provide them with the steam launch they desperately needed to work between the 2 hospitals. About halfway through their coastal tour, Wilfred's prayer was answered. The London office sent the wonderful news that money had been given to buy a steam launch, and Wilfred knew exactly where to find one. He had seen a 45-foot river launch in Chester that he had admired when he was visiting his brother Algernon nearby in Parkgate. The vessel was for sale for £250, less than half the cost of building her, who headed north by land to see if the launch was still for sale. Oh, hold on. Less than half of the bill. The Albert continued on the tour without Wilfred, who headed north by land to see if the launch was still for sale. Thankfully, it was, and he bought it on the spot. Algernon helped him to quickly outfit it for ocean work, and then Wilfred convinced the Allen Line to carry the small craft to St. John's aboard one of its large steamships at bargain price. By the time the Princess May, as the launch was called, was finally stowed in the hold of an Allen Line ship, the Albert was in Queenstown, Ireland. Wilfred rejoined the vessel there, and they headed out across the Atlantic Ocean on June 7, 1893. Wilfred spent his time reading medical texts, conducting Bible studies, and learning more about navigation from Captain Trezise. He was interested to learn that they were taking a more northerly route to St. John's this time, a route called the Great Circle Course. About halfway through the voyage, the Albert was surrounded by towering icebergs. Soon fog engulfed the ship, and it was all hands on deck to watch out for the looming white shapes that could rip the hull open and sink the ship. Thanks to Captain Trezee's skill, the Albert reached the safety of St. John's Harbor on June 26. As the Albert was towed in through the narrow rock wall channel to the harbor, the people of St. John's gathered to welcome the vessel back. Wilfred and the crew disembarked to huge cheers and an invitation to dine with the governor that night. Over the next few days, Wilfred spoke at every church in town. He was thrilled to learn that the committee had gone ahead with plans to outfit 2 hospitals, and the local community had collected $1,500 for the mission to spend helping fishermen. The Allen Line steamer also arrived, bringing with it the 2 nurses and the Princess May. The nurses were welcomed with open arms as they were the only 2 registered nurses in Newfoundland. The local people begged them to stay and work in St. John, but Wilfred was determined that they should serve those who had for so long been beyond the reach of medical help. He promised to recruit more nurses to be stationed in St. John's. When the Princess May was slung out of the cargo hold and into the water, her funnel was missing and her propeller shaft was bent. No one was sure what had happened to the launch, and Wilfred had to wait while a new funnel was made and the shaft was straightened. Finally, on June 6th, the Princess May was christened and commissioned for her work along the Labrador coast. With that formality over, Wilfred, Arthur, an engineer, and 1 other crew member set out in the Princess May on the journey north to Battle Harbor. The Albert set out on the same day for Battle Harbor, but an ocean swell soon separated the 2 vessels. Wilfred skillfully guided the Princess May through driving wind and fog banks and around icebergs to make it safely to the sheltered water of Battle Harbor. The Albert had managed to make it to the harbor the day before, and Wilfred tied up alongside her. As soon as he could, Wilfred went ashore to inspect progress on the hospital.